Good evening, friends, and welcome to the sixth episode of Curmudgeonly Conversation. Tonight's episode is Coleen and the Curmudgeon. And by Coleen, I mean Coleen Rowley, the heroic FBI agent and 9/11 whistleblower who was Time Magazine Co-Person of the Year in the year 2003. Coleen has done outstanding work in defending civil liberties, promoting the cause of peace, and in getting to the bottom of some very important issues in American history regarding alleged law enforcement and some of the malfeasance of law enforcement agencies, including some of those by very powerful people inside of the FBI. Before 9/11, Coleen had noticed that there were people learning how to fly planes who were not interested in learning how to land the planes. They were on a very short list of folks to be watched who had come from overseas. She alerted the people in the FBI, and somehow that didn't seem to make much of an impact on them. And then there were things that happened after 9/11, both in terms of dealing with that situation and the attacks on our liberty and our privacy and our safety by officials in the government in Washington, D.C. That Coleen has been working against and has been helping us to know by being one of our leading whistleblowers and people illuminating these things. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome our good friend, all the way from Minnesota, Coleen Rowley. Coleen, how are you?
Pretty good. And can I start off by just making a minor clarification to that intro?
Okay.
I was the division legal counsel in Minnesota.
Okay.
And not the investigator. I had a lot of roles. I did a lot of things, but mostly I was legal. And we had investigative agents that got calls from whistleblowers at these flight school about their most suspicious student ever. So an INS agent and an FBI agent and the agent supervisor were the ones that actually did all this work in interviewing the people at the flight school. They took the terrorist suspect Moussaoui into custody right away. They were able to even identify the federal law that was being violated, which was sabotage of an airplane. I can't remember the exact title of this, but they were very, very astute. One of them had pilot experience and intelligence experience in the Navy, and they knew what they were dealing with very, very quickly. I was only the legal counsel who had really a small peripheral role in the investigation. I became the whistleblower afterwards, 9 months afterwards, because Mueller, by the way, who we're going to talk about tonight, Robert Mueller, the FBI director, had stalled and was not telling the truth about the intelligence and the clues, including this Moussaoui case, that the FBI had. And they were even thwarting and stalling on investigations of what had gone wrong. So I became a whistleblower because I thought, well, I've got to tell the full truth about what I know about this. The agents would have also told the truth as well. They did not have as many years in the FBI, nor did they have the legal background, because a lot of these issues were legal ones. So I just wanted to make the clarification on that. I was the whistleblower and not the investigator. Anyways, I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. Okay, so having done that, of course, both Mr. Mueller and Mr. Comey have been high-profile individuals for quite a long time, including regarding the 2016 presidential election and efforts to derail the election and Donald Trump's presidency through various means. And there was an Inspector General report which just came out about Director Comey. And following that, he said, well, he was going to accept apologies from critics after that report. But I'm curious as to your response to that, as you look at that report, whether you think he's right to be expecting apologies, or if that report, as some of our friends, I think Jim Bovard and others said, didn't reflect favorably on him, and was probably may not have gone as far as it should have gone, but that Comey is way off base on this. What would you say about that?
Well, for starters, I don't think anyone is putting into context this entire career of both Robert Mueller and James Comey, who, by the way, were basically joined at the hip. They were friends and colleagues, worked together, and especially after 9/11, they bonded very closely. They never should have even appointed Robert Mueller to be a special counsel of this investigation, since it involved the firing of James Comey, and that was one of his best friends. I mean, you would never do this because there's a conflict of interest in a lot of ways. So the fuller context is these two very similar. Our career, they are revolving door types where they make a lot of money in the private sector or in big law firms, and they go back and forth getting more power and influence in government. And they, along the way, when they were FBI directors, made a whole series of really fairly egregious, mistakes, if you want to call them mistakes, and wrongdoing, which really shocked me after Mueller was named special counsel, because he and Comey were put on pedestals. And everyone swept it under the rug, all of these terrible things they had done. I've even seen an article by someone who should know better claiming that James Comey should be treated as a whistleblower. And the problem with that is that James Comey was not motivated in order to benefit the public, giving out some information about a government wrongdoing or an illegal act that would help the public. And his career shows that he's motivated. He earned millions of dollars as a Lockheed vice president. And his whole career has been this revolving door where he gains money and power and proceeds along. He does work with others, of course, in the meantime doing this. That article claimed that he had stopped torture. And in fact, that's not true at all. One of his last acts as a deputy attorney general was to authorize torture. He signed off on it. So the facts in this article claiming that James Comey is a whistleblower were completely wrong, completely. And it said the same thing about surveillance, massive surveillance. That wasn't true either. Both Mueller and Comey had a showing that they looked like they were against it, but in fact, they just changed the legal basis. So, I mean, the real problem here is that when you get into this kind of hysteria where the country is being fed a lot of media propaganda and group dynamics being what they are with the partisanship, most of the people just forget history, and even history from a few years ago. Mueller and Comey have really had a lot of really shameful actions in their past. And so when you get to James Comey being criticized for leaking his memos to lawyer friends, and at least in one case with the explicit goal of that lawyer friend then leaking it to the New York Times, I forget which, but a major media, maybe it was New York Times, I don't remember. But it was all designed to be leaked. And then it was actually designed to be leaked so that his friend, Robert Mueller, would be named a special counsel, basically opening up this 2-year plus investigation of Russiagate, which we now know was really lacking in any substance at all, especially any substance that would connect an American to working with Russia. The Mueller found nothing that he could charge any American who worked with Russia. And so for over 2 years, this thing has been going on. We've obviously suffered every single night through all of these headlines and leaked, lots and lots of leaking. Comey's leaking is minor compared to the leaking that went on. Mostly probably, we can guess at who this was responsible for it, but I think Clapper and Brennan, Obama administration officials, had to have some role. Hayden from the prior one also had to have a role, and there were probably others. But there was so much leaking that went on. And this isn't actual leaking of true information. This is a big difference. Scooter Libby was said to have leaked to the New York Times to Judith Miller about the the aluminum tubes, that he made the story that they were designed for nuclear enrichment in Saddam. That isn't leaking. That is planting false stories. And so, again, leaking is minor compared to planting false stories. Planting false stories is really bad, because what you're doing is you're using this propaganda in order to manipulate public opinion. In the case of Scooter Libby, it was to launch more wars. This kind of thing, and this is the context, I'm glad I get this opportunity, because I don't see this being written about, maybe because people don't want to know how bad this is in the government. I think that both Republicans and Democrats really don't want to know how bad manipulating public opinion is and use of propaganda. The main way that you can manipulate public opinion is not leaking, it's excessive secrecy. Daniel Ellsberg, I think he said once that, at least 90% of all information out there is classified secret when it shouldn't be. Why is that? Why do they classify? They have an arcane classification system that allows almost everything that they want to be secret without any actual independent judgment. There's a group called the Federation of American Scientists, and all they care about is secret. It's called the Secrecy Project, and they talk about this all the time. There have been calls for reform of the classification process for decades, but nothing ever happens. Why? Because powerful people want initially to have excessive secrecy. This gives them a lot of leeway. That way, when people don't know the truth about things, then it gives them this leeway. Then they can plant notions and false information in the media. Whereas if they had a lot more just released, which was frankly the goal of WikiLeaks, was just to make a lot of things more public so that the people could know things, other than landing on Normandy Beach during World War II, obviously there are things, ongoing investigations need to be secret. There is some rationale for limited secrecy over a short period of time. There is. But what happens in government is these powerful people have taken this and put it on steroids so that everything is secret. Now, how does governance even work when everything is secret? You get to the point where nobody can share information. I wrote this article on WikiLeaks and 9/11, What If? Because you find out what caused 9/11, what was the enabling factor. The agencies were not even sharing information with each other. The CIA didn't tell the FBI that they had been tracking terrorist suspects for 3 years, and a couple of them had come into California. The FBI did not share the information from Minnesota about the terrorist suspect in Minnesota. They didn't even share it internally with the next higher level in the FBI. And then certainly no one in government shared any of this. The memos that said bin Laden was going to attack, that none of this was shared with the public. And so you find out that this secrecy is the problem. And why does it exist? It exists because the powerful people have their own agendas and they want to control public opinion. And the first thing they do is have excessive secrecy. Then they work with leaking. So leaking occurs all the time. A Harvard Law Review called it the leaky Leviathan. And in some cases, it's legitimate to leak. Because think about it. What if there's a public official being defamed, falsely defamed? And they say, oh, the FBI has, some information. Well, exactly like the Trump case would fit this example. Okay, so if someone is leaking that and saying, Trump got prostitutes in Russia or whatever, and that's not true, you almost have to then somehow correct that. So, and this happens with once in a while. It doesn't happen a lot, but there are times when it's very legitimate to correct false information. It could even be a public safety issue. Let's say that someone's leaking that someone's going to plant toxins in the water supply, and people are racing, they're racing away, and there could be even a public safety reason for somehow saying, no, that's not true, that's false. That's one case of where leaking might be necessary. And there's the other case is, I forgot, one example was Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. One of the media, I think it was ABC, but I'm not sure, one of the major media found out that the Unabomber, who had been sending mail bombs throughout the country for 18 years, the FBI had no idea throughout these 18 years who was doing it, but eventually they, little bit luck, they found out this guy was living in a little cabin, I think in Montana. But the media found out too. And before he could be arrested, they were on the verge of breaking this. Of course, that would have made for, selling stories, selling newspapers, etc. This would have been a big scoop. And so in that kind of a case, there are times when it's legitimate to, for lack of a better term, leak or disclose to the media. There's a need for legitimacy. Unfortunately, like I said, combined with the excessive secrecy and then the ability to get favorite reporters and then tell them you have a big leak for them. This is what the news swoons over, thinking that they have some public official that's giving them a big leak. It allows for manipulating the public opinion through the press. And this is a lot to correct. It is simply not just, wrapping James Comey on the fingers for having leaked his memos. And so in the scheme of things, it's a very minor compared to everything else. His giving these legal memos they said only 6 words should have been classified. And I will say that actually is a parallel with my memo. My whistleblower memo about 9/11, I did not classify it. I gave it to the Joint Intelligence Committee heads, or not the heads, but people on the Joint Intelligence Committee, senators, who also had the same high-level clearance as I did. And so there shouldn't have been any problem. But the FBI then stamps it secret, classified, based on just a handful of words. They did that because they didn't want the information to get out and have people know that there was so much information before 9/11 and that they should have shared it, etc. And that there was probable cause for further investigation here in Minnesota, which might have prevented or at least lessened 9/11. So I will just say, you don't see this. I'm sorry. I have not seen any of this really analyzed this way in our press. The one thing that Comey, like I said, he's not a whistleblower because he did not have the right motivation for his leaking. This was all part of his career stuff. It certainly was probably part of his Never Trump or all of Brennan and Clapper and most of the intelligence community seemed to have been very worried about Trump's candidacy, first his candidacy and then his being elected. They became even more worried. And along with all of this partisan, whatever you want to call it, partisan, I call it a hoax, I'm trying to think of the word, but all of this stuff that grew up about the dossier, this false, fake hoax dossier that was used, was leaked to the media and then used, and along with that, then Comey, of course, decides to sign off on surveillance of the Trump campaign. It's clear that his motivation was very much political, and that he was very, worried about Trump posing problems probably for foreign policy, because Trump had said many times, he had criticized wars, he had criticized Bush's wars and Obama's wars. And I think a lot of the people, certainly a former Lockheed official who had made millions of dollars, would be very worried about a president like Trump, who was actually criticizing the war efforts. Not that any of this has come true according to his promises, but it still did seem to worry a lot of people in the establishment. So Comey was not motivated as a whistleblower would be, which was to reveal government fraud, waste, abuse, illegal actions, or a serious risk to public safety. I don't think that he meets that test at all. But again, I don't think that his leaking of the memos is the major thing that he should be held accountable for. He should be held accountable for what seems to be coming next, which is the hopefully Inspector General Horowitz is looking into, or has been looking into, the authorization to surveil Carter Page and by extension the Trump campaign from before the election and into after the election, even after Trump becomes president, which seems very wrong and very, very, I don't know how anyone can justify relying on a dossier, the Steele dossier, which Comey admits he never was able to verify. That's incredible. That's absolutely incredible. And we'll have to wait and see if the IG now recommends, or the DOJ recommends, holding any of the people responsible for that. That seems like a much, much bigger thing, and it's out there. We'll see what happens. If they don't hold anyone responsible for that, I would say that that means that there's just a kind of a big club, and they just kind of make it look like they're doing things and, you know, criticizing, but the bottom line is they don't want to hold anyone responsible for anything, and that would be a pattern that we've seen for a long, long time. I hope that they are able to get more to the bottom of that and actually hold people responsible, because this is really, really dangerous for democracy. Secret surveillance of high-level officials that was not properly predicated on any real evidence, and they didn't even verify the like I said, the Steele dossier that they did use.
Right. Well, there's a lot of great information there. And it also makes me think of this idea, ties into what you were talking about, Coleen, about something that Robert Hicks talks about, which is truncating the antecedents. And so we only get, when it's a lead up to a war or this type of a situation, there are people that will cover up what happened earlier, which got us to this point. And in fact, 9/11 is probably a classic example of that in terms of the foreign policy blowback. That Ron Paul and some people at the CIA and I think it was Robert Pape, Dr. Pape at the University of Chicago, and others have talked about, but most people are unaware of it. And so they think, many people in our country think history started on 9/11 regarding all of this. And of course, this goes back decades. And there were, Michael Scheuer is another one who brings this point up as well, that there were motivations. And then there was what bin Laden wanted to accomplish, which was basically to throw a rope-a-dope. And I heard Scott Horton and Danny Shearson talking about this on an interview that they just did the other day. And essentially, they succeeded in what bin Laden was trying to accomplish. And in the meantime, as you point out, we have all of these actions by Comey and Mueller, which the general public has only the vaguest and slightest notion of, because it doesn't get mentioned in the media. And so it's just a little tip of the iceberg that comes up. And there seems to be, whether it's prosecuting these unjustifiable wars of aggression, or this secret surveillance, and we say that they did it to President Trump and his campaign, and it sure looks like they're doing it to everybody. All these stories are coming out now with what's happening, and the frightening expansion of the technological capabilities of the spies to spy against us here at home really leads to a very troubling situation. So, as you say, hopefully there'll be some accountability, but the historical pattern is not encouraging at all in that regard. And as I recall, there's stuff, in fact, regarding the I guess the second Iraq War, isn't there, regarding Comey and Mueller? Wasn't one of them involved in helping to promote the fabrication of some fake intelligence that led to the problem there? And of course, you mentioned torture, and the other thing that we should remind people of is that torture, besides being morally wrong, It typically doesn't lead to useful information from a battlefield standpoint. But you get these propaganda statements, or you get somebody, which is what I guess the North Koreans used to use it for, among others, or you get somebody just saying, "What do you want me to say to make it stop?" And I think this is
Right.
what Cheney was involved, right? Him and Scooter, and then they told it was Al Libby was the guy, and they said, "Say this," and so he said what they wanted him to say to stop the torture, and then look what that led to, because he falsely to stop the torture implicated Saddam on the weapons of mass destruction thing and Al Qaeda and all that. And that led to horrible consequences for the people of Iraq, for the people of America, and for people generally in the Middle East. Isn't that essentially what happened there?
Absolutely. The Al Libby Al Qaeda member was tortured in I think Egypt, and he came up with the false intelligence that Saddam had chemical weapons or whatever, and or was linked to Al Qaeda. I can't remember what it is, but he made up a story to make the torture stop. Tonight on the national news, actually, they talked about false confessions in regard to those 5 young black men that were convicted of a rape in I think it was near Central Park. Years and years ago, they all confessed as, they were teenagers. And it turns out they were completely innocent. DNA exonerated them. They did a long time in prison. And they did the story tonight. They said, why would they have confessed? Well, and this wasn't even physical torture. It wasn't waterboarding. It wasn't. But under duress of interviewing somebody, and especially with people that are less, have less willpower, like a teenager would, or somebody who's maybe not as mentally capable, you can even get a false confession without torturing somebody, physically torturing them, just through use of mental ways, let alone physical torture. So everyone in law enforcement, and I told you from time I was in the first week of training school, we were told that you would get nothing but false, unreliable information through torture. And yet Mueller, after 9/11, he finds out it's happening, and all he does at the time is order the FBI not to do it. And the only reason, too, is we had a strong assistant director that Ali Soufan, who was the agent who found out, first one that found out the CIA was going to start this waterboarding and torture. He went right to that assistant director and he said, the FBI never would do this, would they? And that assistant director then told Mueller, and so Mueller said, okay, we'll let the FBI not do it, but kept their mouths quiet for years and years and years. Comey actually signs off on the torture tactics as one of his final acts in the Department of Justice. And yes, you can't get more it's anti-law enforcement completely. It's completely unreliable. It's just going to lead you on false, even if you say, well, I don't care, I'm hurting this person for whatever reason, it's going to lead you on false, like the Al Libby case. So one of the things I think people didn't understand is when you start going down this road after 9/11 of illegal actions, initially it's predicated upon, we'll do illegal actions, we don't have to worry about constitutional rights with regard to terrorists. So Mueller ordered the roundup of about 1,000 immigrants that just happened to be in the wrong place, New York City, and they were all detained. Now, this is illegal. You detained them for months and months, some of them for a year, some of them were even brutalized and beat up because people thought they were terrorists, and they were just really nobodies. Really, the same thing was mostly true on Guantanamo. They had around 700 some people there, and only a very small, a few dozen, maybe 2 or 3 dozen were actually, had done anything terroristic. The rest of them were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mueller was in charge of all of that. That is completely, like I said, it's wrong, but it's completely inaccurate. And you know what? The people were happy. Americans like, oh, well, those are the worst of the worst. Why? Because it wasn't them. When Snowden disclosed that these illegal actions and tactics were not just occurring on foreign people, but were also now being turned on Americans, it did cause more awareness. And so what happened was they turned it on, Americans that did have they were entitled to constitutional rights, whether they were getting them or not, but they were either dissident groups, in some cases, many cases, of course, Muslims. And increasingly now it will be turned on people that, are said to be white supremacists or quote unquote conspiracy theorists or whatever. So it went from for people who were foreigner, the tactics on foreign people, which no Americans really cared much about. There were maybe some people at the time that had more forward thinking that said, you know what, this isn't going to end here, but very few. And then they became used on Americans. And now with Russiagate, I think you see, actually I warned about this in 2007, you see those tactics having migrated for power-mongering purposes into the most powerful people in Washington, D.C., including intelligence community directors, the deep state people, and including presidents and administration. In fighting for power, they're using these same tactics that began with the so-called war on terrorism. And again, they've just slowly migrated. I said I warned about this in 2007 because we had a newly elected Senator, Amy Klobuchar, who, by the way, knew very little about any of these. She was a prosecutor, but she knew nothing about intelligence, international affairs or intelligence. She knew nothing about this when she was elected as a senator. And she goes, and in August of 2007, when part of the massive surveillance program had lapsed, and I want to say, who was it at the time? It was the NSA director and others. I can't remember the names. They all went to the Hill at like 11 o'clock at night, and they told people like Senator Klobuchar, we're going to have a terrorist attack unless you authorize these very intrusive surveillance authority, which includes Americans. And Amy Klobuchar, yeah, I'll do that. She went along with it. Well, the next day I wrote, this Huffington Post, and I said, don't you understand? This isn't going to be targeted only on people that are not you. You think you're in a club? No, it is going to come back to be the highest levels. Right. And all you have to do is know about COINTELPRO. All you have to do is know history. The people that are going to be targeted for these things are going to be the most powerful people. You could say Nixon Watergate was almost a precursor in a way of Russiagate. And the reason it's a precursor is because you had powerful people, highest levels, thinking that they could do what they tell the CIA to do all the time in foreign countries. It's burglary or whatever. The CIA doesn't bat an eyelash about burglarizing or stealing or even assassinating or torturing, whatever. They don't bat an eyelash about being illegal in foreign countries. And then it slowly migrates home, and you finally get to a point like with Nixon, where he says, okay, let's do it in Washington, D.C., amongst other powerful people. Same thing, I think, in Russiagate. It is just one of these things. We had a lapse of time between the Church Committee, about 1978, where these reforms went into place, and the Attorney General guidelines were quite strict. They did restrain the FBI to a large extent about infiltrating and trapping. Lots of things, by the way, that were very restraining on the FBI, and especially on American citizens. And then after 9/11, slowly, I think this is what my colleague Mike German has written about in his new book, slowly but surely they all got erased. And one of the powerful directors that was part of that erasing was Robert Mueller. First, they erased the Attorney General guidelines. The FISA law was watered down. The Patriot Act is another one, but there's a whole Patriot Act that people always point to that, but that's just one. largely it was the Office of Legal Counsel memos that John Yoo was churning out, and they just set the way for all of these relaxations to the point where obviously they start with Muslims by doing these illegal actions on Muslims, but then on other Americans. And now I think we see them doing it on each other in Washington, D.C.
In fact, that's a great point. I'm thinking about going back to the torture. The Senate committee investigating torture, weren't they spied on by the CIA? Wasn't there something that happened there?
That's exactly. There's a film coming out, a documentary called The Report. And it's the story of this very brave, courageous staffer working for Dianne Feinstein on the torture report for 5 years. This was his life for 5 years. Mm-hmm. And he got a hold of he was able to see the CIA's documents. And Brennan, of course, just blew his top when he found out that they were going to criticize the CIA for torture. And they tried their darndest to go after this staffer. I haven't seen the movie, but I would highly recommend this documentary that comes out. It's gonna, I think it follows the story very closely. It's got actors in it, etc., but it's very close to a documentary called The Report. And that's exactly right. Now you had Feinstein saying, she's a leading senator. She's head of, heads of committees. And she's saying the CIA director was, spying on me. And then the CIA director turned around and said, no, Feinstein is the one. They both were accusing each other, and it turned out Brennan was the one wrong. And so, yes, that's a perfect example. That's, someone should write a book about this, because if you really stop to think about it, it's shown itself in a lot of ways now. And our media just keeps their mouth shut about it. They truncate and pretend like this latest little incident is divorced. It's all by itself, and it has no, root causes, and it has nothing that leads into it. They just keep quiet about it, as if, Robert Mueller, Comey got a hair up his butt in this leaking. No, he didn't. All of these high-level officials leak all the time. Don't you remember about Cheney and Scooter Libby and et cetera? Don't you remember any of this? They do it all the time. Most of the high-level people don't get any punishment for it. They get Petraeus. You get a little tiny fine. That's all he got. Whereas people like Chelsea Manning and Tom Drake, the latest one now, the drone whistleblower, Daniel Hale, that they're going to be prosecuting. I think they're going to be seeking, almost probably a life term, maybe 30 years, like they were 35 years, like they were seeking on Tom Drake. I don't know. I'm just being pessimistic about that. And all he did was he was in a documentary on drone warfare. And he was one of the people. He knew how they were being targeted, how they were killing all the young young males and calling them terrorists and stuff. So it's really sad that we have this, kind of, I think it's almost kind of like empires rot from the inside, and what Trump called the swamp, and other people now have called the blob. I don't know what's better, the establishment, the swamp, the blob, the military-industrial congressional media complex. But it really is now a very big factor, and it's extremely corrupt on many levels. And it's very hard to deal with one little aspect, one little thing, without knowing the background that has led to some of this stuff.
Right. And, trying to get to the basics of it, again, some people say it's actually a result of it's something that we can't prevent unless we deal with some real basic questions like, the Federal Reserve and the monetary system, which helps to finance all this stuff. And then these people come in, and because we have such a centralized system, which is so different than what the Declaration of Independence talks about, and even what in the Articles of Confederation, and even the Constitution itself, allegedly, but excuse me, that then the drive for power is such that these people will then look at it and say they want to have one centralized system so they can all go to one location, either literally or figuratively, and get control over everybody in this country that way. And you look at the effects they can have on this, and a number of people were concerned about this. interestingly, they called this alleged Russian collusion or Russian interference in the election. And people pointed out, well, it's like they're putting pressure on President Trump because when he ran as a candidate, he made what seemed, I believe, were very reasonable statements that why are we having unnecessarily hostile relations with Russia? That makes no sense. Like Pat Buchanan and others have said, we have some areas of common interest. They're not a threat to us, but we have both can be worried about some of this jihadist terrorism, for instance. And yet, but there are people that benefit from that unnecessary hostility. And you mentioned, Coleen, about James Comey and the Lockheed connection. Clearly, the munitions manufacturers are one group. The people that are involved in the electronics of the spying and the monitoring of everybody are another group. So they can use the Russians and sympathy with, or even just say, hey, let's just get along with them, which you say, it's, that shouldn't be scandalous. That is a reasonable thing to ask for. That really should be the goal. But they can paint people like that as being either traitorous or un-American or something. When in reality, it's these people in power who are the ones who are being traitorous and who are attacking the interests of the American people. And that they would then push President Trump away from his stated viewpoint regarding Russia, for instance, and to try to show that he was not Putin's puppet. And what we have now, unfortunately, is a system or a situation where the policy of the United States government regarding Russia is worse than it was under President Obama. And it was bad then. And it's worse now. The actions taken and the hostility shown, having troops right up to the border, and then NATO troops on Russia's border as they expand NATO, and you go read about all that, how that wasn't supposed to happen that way, and actually the Russians are concerned about it. And then the work that the United States government has done with some foreign governments in fomenting these problems in places like Syria, apparently working with Israel and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and some of the European countries, and of course what had happened in the Balkans, during the Clinton administration. So what they've done is President Trump correctly noted that these things didn't make any sense and they were harmful, and then what ended up happening was because of his being pressured on this thing by these other people, that what President Trump has done is he seems to have given in to them on this point, and he said things like, oh yeah, well. At one point he said, yeah, well, we know there wasn't any collusion. Oh, yeah, I meant to say there was. And yet, people have looked into this, and you have it, and Ray McGovern and some of the others at the VIPs, the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, have said, you can look at this and see that not only do they not have the evidence, but that there was such a move by the Russians, but there are technical reasons to say this was not hacking. This was leaking about the Clinton campaign of the Democratic National Committee, information where people should be outraged at what was going on there, and instead they changed the whole conversation, and now we've got this anti-Russian hysteria, and as Tom Woods says, it seems like no matter who you elect, you end up with John McCain when it comes to the foreign policy, and so this thing really is really a rotten situation. And you say, well, if you look at governments that do interfere in elections, the United States government's right at the top of that one. And then there are other governments that seem to be quite heavily embedded in the government in Washington, D.C. with their power and their influence, but it ain't the Russians, But you look at who are the biggest recipients of United States foreign policy aid. Who are the people that the United States government, including the Trump administration, enable in their attacks, including in Yemen, promoting starvation and cholera, including what's happened to the people in Syria, including what's happened to the Palestinians, including a lot of other examples too, including these attacks on Iran, and Iran, of course, being a leading opponent of the Sunni jihadi terrorism. And then I think back to the NDAA of 2012 and another thing, right? And the whole indefinite detention thing, and we were all concerned, right, as we should be, how loose that was. But one of the things they said was, well, if you give aid and support to associated forces fighting against the coalition, or take actions or say things detrimental to coalition members, but we have the United States government doing that very thing. And yet it's no accountability there, of course, is there? Yeah,
the basic model for propaganda, it comes right out of World War II and Goring's, well, people don't want to go to war. Nobody wants to, but it's easy to get them to go to war. Even in a democracy, you just tell them they're being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism. And what you are explaining with what even in Russiagate for denouncing the mainstream media, denouncing Trump as being a collaborator with Putin, many of us who criticized the Iraq war were denounced as somehow in league with Saddam. Same thing, with Gaddafi when Obama wanted to bomb Libya. Oh no, you must like Gaddafi. You must like the in Ukraine. You must like the Russian, not the Russian, but the prior leader of Ukraine that was toppled by the U.S. This is like an old model now. It's been used over and over and over. You would think people would wise up. You would think that they would say Tulsi Gabbard is being denounced in some cases by mainstream media as being a Russian asset and whatever. She's suffering the same fate as Trump right now. And again, this has little to do with party. These are powerful, and I would say war profiteering interests that want to keep the status quo, and it's just becoming more and more dangerous. The Cold War all it takes is a spark when you have troops like this and you have drones. You saw these issues with Iran where a drone gets shot down and then you're called on to retaliate, and then you retaliate. All of a sudden you have nuclear bombs going off and nuclear winter. So it's beyond dangerous. It's worse than this old Dr. Strangelove movie. Tulsi Gabbard, by the way, is calling attention to the arms race and the dangers of it. There's a handful of people that are very, very worried, including even a former defense secretary. There are people that are very worried about this, and yet, largely in our discourse, because of our mainstream media and partisanship plays a huge role in this, because as long as they can divide people and make them believe that their group is holier, is a lesser evil, whatever, than the other group, they're always going to be susceptible to being conned. That's the bottom line. They're just going to, a good example, I just posted this one on Facebook. I guess we'll probably have to cut short here pretty quick, but Biden on the campaign trail right now is saying that he opposed, if of all things, you can't even believe he can say this. He's saying that he opposed the Iraq war from the start. He told NPR or somebody, as soon as I knew about the Iraq war, whatever, I opposed it from the start. Well, it's just the opposite. The facts are that he not only went along with it, he helped to sell it, he voted for it, and even months and years later, he was still justifying the U.S.'s war on Iraq and saying that Bush did the right thing. So complete opposite. Go back to Goring. I mean, how can you sell a lie that much? Number one, it's possible Biden is so senile he doesn't remember himself. It's possible. Or he somehow is in his own head. He's fooled his own head into believing he opposed it, even though he voted for it, he pushed for it, etc. His own son died in the Iraq war that he pushed for, so maybe he has some kind of a defense now to defending his own self from knowing. I don't know. But how can people who, anybody who's over, let's say, 40 years old who lived through this, I cannot understand how he could get away with this. His own supporters must, number one, think, it doesn't matter. I don't care that Biden started the Iraq war. Even though he lies about it now, he's still a fine man. Either they don't care at all, or they are that, whatever the word is, I said they live in the United States of amnesia and they cannot remember. But that is a clear lie right now. The partisanship of Biden's supporters are part of the problem, because that partisanship is going to stop them, from some of them at least, from knowing. The guy that we want to push to be president is lying like hell.
Hillary Clinton did.
An outright lie. Millions of people died, including his own son. And he's lying like hell, but it's fine with me. because I'm a Democrat and I'm a Biden supporter. It's the only thing that matters to me. That's incredible. And that's part of what this politicization and partisanship, people, I don't care what party you're from, everybody should be against wars of aggression. We should have, there were, before the Iraq war started, there really were, millions of people that were against it. But over time, this propaganda has really taken root. And it's just a very sad thing to look out there and see whenever it works. And this Russiagate that went on for 3 years is one example, but there are many, many other examples. All of the wars that have been started have all been started, at least to my knowledge, based on lies, and especially the post 9/11 ones. Every single one of them, you take them apart, and they were all based on lies.
Right. Yeah. And you go back in history, and yeah, that's a theme that goes through all these things. It's okay. So we know that again, it's war profiteers, either financially or politically, are pushing these things. Comey and Mueller are part of that group, and so people need to look into that and realize that what the major media is telling us about this whole situation is wrong, and that they can go after people like President Trump and all the rest of us too. And there's a whole lot that they need to be aware of in this regard. It's very, very frightening situation, but people need to be awake. And Coleen, you've been awake about this for a very long time, and I want to thank you for your time tonight in explaining this. I'm hoping we can do this again sometime. It was really a pleasure.
And can I just mention that I wanted to recommend this new book that's just out. It's just coming out by former FBI agent Mike German. He's a friend of mine, and it's about a lot of these issues that we've just been talking about and how all of the laws have been subverted after 9/11. I even have I have not read it, but I think he even writes about my whistleblowing in this book.
Oh, okay.
So I wanted to recommend, it's entitled Disrupt, Discredit, and
Divide.
Divide. What I was just talking about, divide. Right. Disrupt, discredit, and divide. And it's Mueller picking up on what J. Edgar Hoover did. That was the motto during the COINTELPRO. And that is exactly what Robert Mueller and James Comey and many, many others picked up on after 9/11 to put us into this terrible situation we're in right now.
You're right. Oh, and another real quick point. What you mentioned earlier, the media doesn't pick up on this stuff. So when books like this come out, or work by John Whitehead or Jim Bovard, and by yourself and others, and also, so folks are aware, Daniel McAdams was just permanently banned from Twitter. And Daniel McAdams does great work on these issues with Ron Paul. And the whole thing was he was criticizing Sean Hannity, who was on TV talking about the deep state wearing a CIA pin. I just saw where they kicked a whole bunch of videos and things off of the platforms. And so there's a lot of work done to try to keep people unaware of what's going on. They're trying to bury history. And so we have to do whatever we can to make sure that doesn't happen. So.
Oh, my gosh.
Thank you, ma'am.
Very sad. Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a great night, and we'll talk again soon.
Okay.
Bye, Coleen. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was Coleen Rowley from Minnesota, and she's obviously extremely knowledgeable. I urge you to go to her Facebook page and look up things that she's written about these topics. They're very, very important, very well done. And I want to thank our good friends John and Kathy Irvine, who make the facilities of the John and Kathy Irvine Recording Studio available for curmudgeonly conversation. Thank you, and good night.